You've noticed some people are gone. The scholars who are working on the book are here to do their research, and so we've sent them off to do a tour of Series 4, and they're thereafter going to start doing some writing at Seabreeze, and maybe a walk around Hillingham. So we'll see what they end up doing. So part of this forum was a kind of a blend, because we're pivoting towards this book, and we want to be able to continue to do the forum so that the scholars can come and do their research. But we didn't want to lose the conversation, the kind of conversation that we had last year, where people could just feel free to say what they wanted to say and maybe talk a little bit about art and their own experience. So I've asked Joe and Craig to help me out. To try and maybe not animate. I'm sure everyone has things to say, but at least read the questions ahead of time and be assured that at least there one or two answers would be forthcoming, so we wouldn't be sitting in a vast silence. We do have a couple of mics, and I was wondering if there's one there. There's a couple more. Let's make sure that everyone has access to one. So what I'm going to do, in perhaps defiance of my spirit of informality that I have so brashly announced earlier, I will read.
Back to the right place.
Right. Are they on?
They should be on already.
All right. You can. And you're rolling.
Yep.
Okay. We can hear each other anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a big deal. It's just.
Hello.
Sometimes people say nuggets of wisdom that are nice to get down. I'm going to direct I'm going to ask questions one by one, and we can discuss them and then kind of move on as we see fit. But if anybody has any other questions, I did in the invitation say if you had any other questions that you would want to ask people as a result of being here. A lot of people have been here for multiple years. If there are any other questions that you would like to raise, then just feel free to do so. I'm going to be loosely moderating, but I'd rather have a more informal discussion on a wide range of your experience. So, with your permission, I'd like to start. Are there any other questions as to the format? All right. Jeffery offered a definition of art as one that struck me when I first came here as being that addressed my realm in terms of what I was doing in the world. I perceived that I was really working, doing work that I felt was, work that I could feel conscionable about. And I thought, here's somebody who's actually kind of encroaching on my area and trying to tell me something about what I do. And I thought that was really interesting and kind of audacious and wonderful in a way. So that's what kind of stuck in me, along with, like I said, the beauty of it all. And that definition was art as an act of will in accord with a mature conscience, which for him, he later said to me that wasn't really so much a definition for other people, it was a definition for himself. And that, my interpretation of that, may or may not be applicable might not be applicable to me or anybody else other than him, but he intended that to be a self-measuring statement, and that the artist would measure that against their own conscience. And but I think that there's a good suggestion. It might, from my opinion, a useful way of looking at art as well. I really do believe so. He distinguishes conscience as a genetic characteristic, which can be expressed variably, to morality, which he discusses it as group norms, which are basically rationalizations, as we were hearing in Arthur Farrell's presentation. Morality might be going to war against Troy because of some rationalization that you might be doing the morally correct thing in that case. And so these for Jeffery, these rationalizations do at least emerge in the evidence of war at the beginning of agriculture. But that what predates that is our sense of conscience, and the sense of conscience being something genetic. So, for Jeffery, a mature conscience is something that is informed by the total knowledge of the artist. And what I always found so interesting about his work is that he doesn't draw these distinctions, which was why you get these wildly broad forums, where you have art historians and you have military history and like biology, and just as kind of incredible. But it's this being willing to take in the totality of knowledge and try and come to terms with it. That I think is so. And that's how he also defines maturity, in the sense of actually coming to terms with it and being informed. But the question that I wanted to raise, and that Chero and Craig have confirmed are good questions by my consulting them, and they're not suggesting any major changes. How would you all distinguish between conscience and morality? We have this proposition that sits in the work and it's quite clear that for Jeffery, morality is something very plastic and moldable and changeable, and that conscience is something that is maybe something that's prior to that, or maybe something that everybody can access, or that has a genetic or a human basis that isn't sort of subject to external powers. And then, does maturity apply to both of those concepts? Or if you don't agree that they're different, does some other way of assessing that apply? And does any of this apply to art, in your opinion? And is the description of art that he provides help in any way? Is that useful to you? Does it accord with your own experience of art? Does conscience play any kind of role in your perception of art, or your art making, or morality? Is that something that figures in your understanding of art? So I'd like to open the floor to the first set of questions, and just feel free to say whatever you feel like you need to.
I can believe that conscience is genetic. In the sense that my dog has conscience. My dog knows when it's done something wrong. And exhibits a behavior that reveals that. And I even have a pet macaw who says sorry. And she'll bite him and say sorry. I'm not sure she really has a conscience.
Do you see that there's that's in any way different than this concept of a rationalized conscience, or does that get?
Oh well, of course, only humans can do that, I think. But I don't think it's different. It's just an elaboration on probably the genetic emotion of conscience.
I think a lot of it has to do with in what language you raise this question.
Yes.
English, perhaps not, at least what I find is not the best way, not the best media to talk about what happens in the human mind. The same way as Eskimo may have 30 different words for snow, English is extremely limited, and there is too much confusion between conscious and consciousness and all of the above. But at least what I can say to me, and correct me if I may read it wrongly because it's not my native language, but at least in Russian, there is a very clear distinction between conscious and morality. Conscious can be applied only to an individual. It's always internal. It's always what comes from inside. Morality is something which always imposed from outside. Thinking about that, morality is always a set of rules that you choose or not to choose to follow, but this is external. Conscious, it's a It's a system of guidance which is internal, and I can totally resonate with it. And you know, when I first time I heard Jeffrey's the way he formulated it, mature conscious, it really rang a bell for me because it means it's mature enough. So as an artist, it can provide you a guidance in the decisions that you're making, in the turns that you make within your own mind when you create an art piece. Because if you, without the guidance, it becomes just a random wandering by try and error. And as you know, their possibilities in art are limitless. You cannot possibly create a significant artwork just by trying this and then trying that. It's not going to work. You have to have the means to guide yourself to that destination, to that perfection. And to me, this is what maturity means. And conscious means the internal guiding force. Morality is external. I definitely can see the difference there. And I can see how the conscious is a product of evolution, not only genetic, but also product of evolution of our civilization. When morality is more whimsical, one day you can paint the nudes, the next century you cannot possibly paint the nudes. In one culture you can paint anything you want, in the other culture you cannot possibly paint anything which remotely resembles a human being. So this is keep changing all the time. So I think that I can see that when the artist, especially let's say somebody during the even Renaissance, was forced to follow a certain forms of morality in their work, but the true guiding force for them in their creativity was their conscience.
So you really see that, and you see that.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I would have thought of conscience as being something internalized, particularly from one's childhood experience, and morality as being something much bigger and I suppose universal in a sense. I mean, it's usually qualified by conventional morality. That means the morality of the day. And then there is the morality which is much vaguer, but it tends to guide the bigger kind of movements in human activity and the harm done to the innocents and the weak and that kind of thing, which tends to be much more of a universal, cross-cultural thing. I guess I have always thought of conscience as being the guilt that is installed, often by one's parents, about, you don't bash your sister's head or take her toys or whatever. So I guess, it's just an argument about words, but...
You're right, though, that people use conscience as a... If we use your typology of inside-outside, you can see how somebody would say, don't you have that inside voice telling you that's wrong, but actually I'm telling you should have it.
Yes.
So I'm prescribing your own inside voice from outside. So it could get confusing because conscience is often regarded as a negative thing, like whispering in your ear when you're doing something wrong.
Well, it's the angel on your shoulder.
Right.
Not the
Yeah.
devil.
Also, I think, it's also it's the result of the Christian culture where the conscious is perceived as strictly bipolar, black and white, right from wrong.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's something far more complex, which necessarily doesn't differentiate between good and bad. Not because it can't, but because, for an artist, this internal guidance is far more complex and multidimensional. It doesn't always translate to simplistic solutions. Do this and don't do that. You need something far more elaborate. And I think in some ways, conscious in this regard, the final stage of its maturity is individual. It starts with our genetic heritage, then it's our cultural heritage, but the last bit in it, it's personal. What you as a person can add on the top of it to create this navigational aid for yourself in your own creativity.
Just the mature conscience then.
Exactly.
Because you've worked through your levels of conscience until you've reached some place. I don't know what word you would use to describe it.
Clarity.
Clarity. Yeah. You know, I don't even want to say spirituality.
Yes, that's
No,
what
that is different.
That's different again.
Do you think that when you say the genetic component in conscience, that empathy is a genetic?
No.
Okay, so what are we talking about genetics here?
No, not what I mean by it's genetic component is first of all we are human beings, right? As an organism, we wouldn't come to existence if not for millions and millions of years of evolution. Our brains are made a certain way, we function a certain way. Without any of that, we wouldn't be at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, this is millions of years of evolution of life. Then on the top of it is the period where our genotype hasn't changed in any significant way, as Jeffery has said, right? But what happens is that our civilization, our environment changed. And we now actively changing it as a feedback. So we're filtering what was only genetic. So think about it, genetic is a foundation. If some aliens on a different planet involved in a completely different environment, the way how they perceive reality, the way how they work with it would be totally different from ours. Then there's our civilization, which adds to it. And then, the final element is a personal choice. And this choice is not what set of rules we decide to do. I think it's a final step for an artist to reach maturity, is to reach that level of clarity when you can say to yourself, I know how to get there. I know that place. If I go there in my mind, I can create art.
So you're saying that essentially the genetic part of conscience is a tabula rasa. It varies, what you're saying is the nature versus nurture argument again, isn't it? That it really, we have potential, but it depends where you're born and in what
Depends
time.
when you're born, when you're raised, your culture, your time, etc.
Yeah, and all those things. So that is put in, after infancy or during whatever.
Yes, it would be hard to argue otherwise. I know
Yeah.
tomorrow we'll have another argument of that. But I think one of the simplest way to put it is, at least to me, it's the question of time spans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because for any significant genetic changes, it takes a lot of time.
So I think really speaking of it as a genetic thing is not really that,
There's,
to me it doesn't really mean
well,
very
there's,
much.
It does, actually.
there's a couple of language that I recently came across, which are traits, which are more like characteristics, personality. We can tease apart some of the things that are commonly lumped together as human personality, where a genetic component might be a predisposition to something. So David's going to present an argument that moral sense is like a sense of sight. It doesn't predict the outcome, but it predicts that there's the ability to do something, and you can infer that by certain evolutionary logic. Again, it's going to be an inference. But that the outcome of that, if that's filtered through as an enormous amount of culture, information, and environment, might have completely different outcomes. So I actually disagree. I do think that empathy probably has a foundation genetically. I seem to think that there's some kind of evidence for that scientifically, that there's some mirror neurons, and there's some kind of biological trait, inherent capacity for some kind of some of these traits that we would associate with people of conscience. But the experience of conscience is what Sergei is saying. Is the experience of conscience is much more a navigational thing, as opposed to what you're using is the language of morality. Is like, I'm nice to you, I can feel your feelings, and therefore, I'm a good person. But that's not the kind. I think that I want to complicate conscience a little bit by saying that's part of the mix, because if David will argue, if we didn't if we weren't able to, feel what somebody else might be feeling or have a theory of mind, then we would never be able to, build social groups that were competitive or that
Well, the sociopathic phenomenon.
Right.
Those
So
are people that
if everyone was sociopathic and didn't have any perception of the other person's mind or feelings. So, but what Sergey is saying is that's one of many kinds of traits that go into being a human being. And it's difficult to, we're not maybe at the stage that we can pick out those things. But that's just my opinion. But
I like the definition of clarity a lot. I think that's...
If I may add, because I think it's suffice to say that every trait that can be possibly point in a human being is a result of genetics.
Yes.
The same way, but it's not saying much. The same way we can say every trait, whether it's affinity for others or a hatred of others, is also the result of physics.
right.
Because we exist in the
Physical
universe.
space, yeah.
So it doesn't say much.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what I do believe, again, if you look at the time scales, that the human civilization, it's only like 40,000 years tops. There could be no significant genetic changes during that time. So what is happening, what actually makes our civilization take off, is the development of this external universe, so to speak. And what really appeals to me, when Jeffery talks about the age of agriculture, the concept of granary. It's such a simple concept, but it creates a perception of future. It creates an external world which guides human being behavior. It's no longer what I want, what I feel, what I do. It doesn't matter whether I'm altruistic or whether I'm hateful of other people. It's still my own action. But in the age of agriculture, the fact that I have to save the seeds for the next year, it creates a notion of something external which will govern our lives. And that's where civilization takes off. So from that moment on, this external knowledge base filters whatever impulses we may have. In some ways it limits us, in some ways it enables us, but that's what defines us. That's why I think it's a very important part of consciousness. And the last part is, the last leg of the journey that everyone has to make by themselves, because it's your mind that you're using in creative process. It's not somebody else's mind. Knowing that Beethoven was a genius and reading his biography is not going to help you to compose music. You have to find what works for you.
I'm wondering if those people who either been artists, are artists, or are around art a lot can tell me how this concept does or doesn't apply to their practice and the practice they see. I certainly see that artists at least look like to me that they're operating a degree of concern for larger concepts. It looks like conscience to me. A lot of the artists that I know of personally have a conventional view of morality that doesn't extend much beyond what is already available in their community. So their work is great, but it doesn't penetrate much further than that, which already exists. So that would be my criticism of that. But it's not necessarily that they're operating without it; they're just at the same level as it. The consciousness that they're immersed in, they agree with, and that they're amplifying certain parts of it. But I'm wondering if that's the same experience, or is there a different basis that artists use for their internal fuel for this, so to speak? I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts on that.
It was interesting that as you spoke, you used the word morality. You interchanged that with, you began speaking of conscience.
As soon as I started thinking about the artist, I interchanged it. Yeah.
So I think that is the source of confusion for a lot of people, and I'm wondering, Carol, if that's what you're confused about as well. Is, you're thinking conscience of not hurting someone, like a little sister that you learned. That's an imposed morality, I think.
Mm-hmm. It is. Well, it's a behavioral code.
Yeah.
I see more morality as being something deeper, I guess. I mean, this is just the way in which here we go again, arguing about English. You know, I mean, it's like endless. But the way that I would use morality is something deeper and more universal.
Yes.
In my common use, whereas conscience is much more just a societal, cultural thing, which is installed.
No,
Isn't it the opposite?
It could be, yeah. I mean,
Well, Carol, there's a tradition that you're speaking to of ethical, like rational ethics, which purports to be a universal moral code, which philosophers have been trying to figure out for a really long time. So if you're really, I mean, it's not like you're just making that up. I mean, that
no,
really
I didn't think I
No,
was.
the thought that you could have a universal moral code, which would be based on some kind of rational ethics, exists as a project. So you could, I think it was pretty obvious to people that morality was, somebody had to make up the morals of the rules, or they didn't come from nowhere. So then the question was, well, if they didn't come from, what authority would they come from? It probably wasn't a question, it probably just was taken. But the Enlightenment philosophers were trying to figure out what, could you actually come up with some rational way of coming up with morals? And I think that there's ethical, there are ethical philosophers, and we'll hear about things like bioethics and legal ethics, where you actually need to do that. Like morals are, you for a specific time and a specific problem and a specific local situation, you do need to come up with some kind of basis for acting in a rational way. And that is that it could be, for example, human rights are an interesting example of that, because that's, they try to say that those are universal moral things, the right to life and all these other great things. But those are, in Sergei's taxonomy, external values. They're not necessarily, those would be external morals, even though we might think that human rights, as they're declared by the UN, are very universal. Like how could you argue with not being for torture or those kinds of things?
But it's not really, I don't think rational is the right word to use in terms of ethics, because rational is essentially neutral. I mean, it's whatever serves an end. When I say that, I mean, it's easy to talk about morality when you use extremes. Like in the Greeks, they had Cronus who consumed his children. Well, that was clearly not on. That was weird. I don't know. I mean, it's.
What do you mean by not rational? I mean, keep
Well,
going. Don't give up.
Rational is it tends to be more of a conscious thing to me than an empathic, say the place where empathy comes from, which is a blend of a whole bunch of experience and,
How does it work for you?
Rational?
Well, just this subject,
Oh.
personally.
Oh, I think that I find it very interesting, and I don't want to bog down in this argument about the words,
This
just
is
the
coming
words.
up tomorrow, is it, this discussion?
I don't know.
This discussion's coming up right now. There's a question, doesn't morality affect conscience? I mean,
does it for you? I don't know.
Well, if
I'm not an expert.
you're raised as a young person and you've got a loving mother and she takes you to Sunday school and church and you learn these values, and then do they have a part in that conscience?
I would argue that yes, it does, but then the word mature comes into play.
Mature.
So I think the first stage of maturity is to move beyond what is imposed and see the difference. Because, as you said, with human rights, regardless whether I agree or disagree with it, as long as I recognize something which is external versus something which arises in me.
Yeah.
And for the artist, it's very important. Just simply for a member of a society, having just simply issues of morality which are external, some you agree, some disagree, it's fine. But for the artist who is trying to find his own or her own voice, to be original, it's very important to get in touch with your own conscience. And if you simply follow what others tell you that this is a good thing to paint this way or it's not a good thing to paint that way, you're not going anywhere. But if I may, I would like to add to the rationality and other things. We still, I think, suffering from hiccups of 19th century.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think just a little detour for it, I think it would help to explain it, because look at us as evolved animals, right? Except for the last brief moment in our evolutionary history, the primary concern was a decision whether you fight or flight. How do you eat and how do you avoid being eaten? So, no, the reproduction was built in.
Once a year.
Yeah, whatever. But in terms of decision making, if you watch the animals, right, the first decision that they want to make when they see something new, do I investigate or I run away? Is it food or not? So that type of development ingrains a desire for safety. And what's safety? Safety is predictability. Safety is something just more easy to navigate. Why do we build buildings which have flat floors, square windows, and vertical walls? Overwhelming majority throughout human history. Because for our perception, seeing horizontal lines, vertical lines, it's easy to navigate. So now let's fast forward to the 19th century. When the philosophers of the 19th century started to think about the universe, they wanted it to be safe. They wanted it to be rational. They wanted it to be mechanistic. They wanted things to be not just, they weren't seeking understanding per se. They were seeking satisfactory explanations which makes everything predictable, stable, unchanging. And a lot of arguments that we still have in philosophy, ethics, and other things, they come from it. And now comes 1960s, 1970s, and now 1990s. Our physical universe goes to bits. Our universe is no longer just moves to stable state. It's expanding faster and faster. We have quantum mechanics, we have instability. In theory information, we realize that there are certain things we cannot possibly know. In mathematics, it has been proven very recently in the 20th century that you cannot build a system without of thought, without internal contradiction. So pretty much there's not much left of this ideal of the 19th century of safety. So that's why when we pick up ethic arguments, we have to, they're interesting, they're important, but we have to remember who started them and why.
Yeah, that was my point, was that there was a, and I would say still is, we would call it, I guess, a lag from the 19th and 20th century, right? To me, the 20th century had a lot of this kind of universalizing philosophy with the rise of sociology, and I mean, this was a very big drive, was to try and figure out what you could say, anything universally about what is good or bad in society. And that was, I mean, it just preoccupied the 20th century. So anyway, we can move on, unless anybody else has something to say about this.
I'm just trying to think it through still, but for me it seems like the distinction also that David makes is that conscience is an individual motivation, whereas morality is about the collective, right? So ethics and morals that are socially accepted are based, I think, on tenets that are true to everyone, which I think that there are some really basic rights and wrongs that most people would agree upon, which is like, you don't kill someone, that's bad. Or like you said, like that you just, it's not on. Well, I think that there are things like that we just innately agree upon, right?
You tend to come to the agreement about things that you want to do and not want to do. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I was also thinking about Arthur's paper and the idea of ranking within military, and that was necessary because it's not necessarily natural for people to kill, for instance. So, like that's an example of having a kind of a genetic inherited conscience of some kind.
I don't know, you said that.
And-
we don't know, do we know that?
I'm not sure to know it, although it does seem to be the case. I mean, it's hard to train warriors in any society, I suspect, because of that feeling that we shouldn't kill other human beings.
But I think, and then this brings, I think, some maybe morality is more flexible within these groups. Like, I don't think it's a universal morality. Like, it's tough to kill, it's hard to kill, killing's bad, whatever. Yet, part of this thing, the paper mentions execution of one of your own, and that's accepted. Like, that's more or less seen as a moral behavior. This person's done something or needs to be sacrificed. Killing is not morally unacceptable.
But it's still, I mean, it's mentioned only because it's rather difficult to understand how any society can prove that.
Yeah, well, your conscience, I guess that's when we talk about soldiers being unable to kill or not pull the trigger, that's conscience.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't want to execute your buddy, and that's conscience. But morality, your collective group says this person must die.
Yes, but remember in a lot of the executions that are done by firing squad, only one of those soldiers has a live bullet.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Oh,
So it's the group comparative then.
And that
They don't
gives everyone the possibility of thinking it wasn't his bullet.
Or electric chair, where there are three handles and only one of them can act.
Oh, they have to do this in order for people to actually do it.
Yes.
Right. Mhm. And that gets back to what you were bringing in earlier about this idea of social order and policing in a way too. That, and that's maybe where like a kind of a social, a moral code allows an agreement among groups that these are the rules of order in order to maintain order, I guess.
I think that when you were both speaking, I really got a clear picture of what you were saying, but I want to make sure, Paul, that you get a chance to jump in. So just, yeah, I got it. I have a response, but please go.
Well, I don't know. When we're talking about conscience and morality, I assume that since we're talking about the artist, we're talking about personal attributes and our personal morality, not necessarily a public morality, but how a person lives their lives. Now, for me, I was thinking about conscience. To me, is a choice or a decision. I mean, it's an act of conscience. Because I guess you can have a conscience without doing anything.
Yeah.
But if you have an act of conscience, it's a decision to do something that requires self-sacrifice, presumably for the good of someone else. Whereas, for me, my personal morality, it seems, is like an accommodation to the needs of society, so that I am not encouraging them to do what I don't want them to do, or get back at me. And it's the important thing is it's expressed variably on a continuum. Like, I do believe there are people without anything that I would associate with having a conscience. And that's, so I would distinguish between the two as one, maybe it is genetic or physical, but it's what you come with. The question is, the second one, does maturity apply? Well, how do you help a conscience to mature? And how does your morality or your moral behavior mature? How do you do that, and how do you know when it's done? Or when you're close enough?
You're done.
Well, no, I know I'm not there yet. I'm reminded
work in process
frequently.
If conscience is an important aspect of art and mature conscience, then has anyone ever studied, so far as you know, sociopaths in connection with their
question of the Hitler's art.
Question.
I had you remember that forum where we had Hitler's art up? And there was
Yeah.
it wasn't Hitler's art, it was like some exhibition of Hitler's art that was basically defaced.
Faces all over it. It was quite a famous
Yeah.
British artist.
And I think that
It was exhibited at the Saatchi.
oh, was it? Does anybody can anybody answer that question? I mean, that's an interesting question. That
I try. Well, it actually boils down to what we define as art. There are conflicting points of view. One of them is categorization. You put some paint on a canvas, you chisel a piece of rock, it's art. The other one is that the art is actually essential ingredient to make a work of art alive and speak to the others. That's what I like. I mean, to me, to see if something is art or not is very simple. You stand in front of a piece of art. Does it give you goosebumps? Does it turn your stomach even before you start to analyze it? If you sense it, that's art. And I photographed in my early days thousands of paintings in museums and other things. And that test never failed. I've never seen a piece of art created by sociopaths. I created a lot of doodling, angry pieces and other things, but none of these pieces actually had this genetic appeal to me in many ways. So that's why I still would come back to what I said, it's just you have to have a clarity and mature conscious.
But I wasn't thinking so much of sociopaths as artists, but what kind of appreciation of art does a sociopath have?
Probably not.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, probably not. But I must add, and that's an interesting question because to me, creating art and viewing art is a completely separate process. Even when I look at the pieces of art that I create, it may take me to a certain place in my mind, but it's never the same. And I'm yet to find any correlation. To do art, you go this way. To view art, it takes you somewhere else. So that's why I was unable to combine the two. So doing is one thing, appreciating is something completely different.
I like to give a few days when I'm working, doing the painting, and if I feel I've done it, then I could put it away, go away, look at it again in a week. Then it's a whole other, then you're, like you're saying, you're viewing, you're not working.
Do you feel like, Juan, when you come back to a piece, because I know you've come back to a couple of pieces, really long time. Yeah. Do you feel like you're coming back to them as a viewer or as an artist first or second, or do you feel like there's how does that work?
Maybe you can see something that you didn't see before. I've done that with paintings where just the slightest little change just makes it, to me, perfect. But I didn't catch it. So it was rolled up for 10 years. It came out. It had been shown. It rolled up, taken out, adjusted, and then 2 days later someone comes and buys it. That sort of experience is kind of a magic. Some kind of magic to that. I don't know. Not that selling things is the magic that much, but it's just the connection of that finality of something that we're working on. And being able to come back to it and adjust it.
At least you know it's finished. So
Pardon me?
Yeah.
At least you know it's finished.
Well, when it's gone, yeah.
How's it now?
I'll bring us back to the point from Jeff's page. He read this today, there's things that he's been thinking about, where he says, he's talking about David Wallace, And he says it soon became clear in conversation that he was the rare combination of a scientist with strong art perception. Now those two words, art perception, I think very, very interesting and mean a lot to Jeff. And I think that's what you're describing when you talk about being in front of a piece that has art in it, that is art. You feel it, you know it, if you are one who can perceive art. If you're not, you can enjoy the beauty of it, you can enjoy the colors, you can enjoy the texture, the light on it, different things like that. But I think there's a difference between having art perception and appreciation of it. And I think that is what Jeff is pointing out about David, having perceived that about him, which is Jeff's perception of David.
Craig and I have been having good conversations since reading David's paper in particular, because these questions really relate to that. And so we're both curators, and Craig's an artist. And so there's always this question about, well, why do we do what we do? There's a lot of organization that happens around having to put exhibitions together so the public can see artwork. And so for me, I was kind of coming back to this, like trying to tie it in to what I think maybe is a bit of an idealistic vision that Jeff has, that I like to hold in me most of the time, because if I didn't believe in what I did, then I wouldn't bother. So, I mean, he's talking about this crisis of rationalization and the age of agriculture and the military-industrial complex. And so my conclusion about what he's on about is that art is a kind of savior, in a way, or the artist in society is a necessary good in raising consciousness. So to me, I think it's kind of about breaking it down between the art as the object, a thing that exists, maybe like an energy even, that the artist is putting into the world that is about a raising of consciousness on some levels. But then it's also, I think that there's kind of three parts. Then there's the artist, their role, and this is where this mature conscience comes in. And then there's the other level of this perception or the reception of art. So I guess I want to always believe that it certainly, like, making exhibitions raises people's consciousness, or it makes you think differently. So I guess then the question always comes back to, for me, is like, well, is that going to take us out of this crisis of rationalization then? Is that, like, really, is it, does art have that
activist
power?
enough, or does it?
Well, no, it doesn't have to be activist, but I mean, this is the alternative, that why we're here, right? Why we're blending science and art, and we're talking about all these ideas in a way, and getting out of the specialization of our fields, so that we can talk about the power, I guess, that our artists have.
Last year
Given.
I asked that question.
Yeah.
I guess my answer that I got is that in itself is a rationalization of, like, on the one hand, asking yourself why do it is a rationalization itself. So if you feel that
That's not the question I'm asking.
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's more that I think that, to me, the proposition is that art and artists have there's a mature conscience there that can elevate us beyond this crisis of rationalization. No?
Yeah, I don't know.
How do we tie art back into this discussion while we're talking about?
Do you feel like art has informed your life in terms of your own internal?
Totally.
Yeah.
In every way.
Yeah. What more is there?
And I don't think we could exist without it.
Right.
I'm just trying to stretch it to like, well, what is the goal of for instance, what Jeff's doing here, what we're doing here? Like, if we're trying to link these ideas back to, for instance, this distinction between like where you see these changes possibly in cave paintings that are depicting war, and then what happens due to the age of agriculture and warfare. What Jeff's saying is that we're in a crisis, right, because of this rationalization.
I think the art definitely has an important role to play, but I don't think it's an obvious one. Let's go back again to 19th century and this drive for safety. The militarization and starting wars, ironically, it's a human genetic desire for safety. Let's eliminate everybody who is not like me. Let's create an army that nobody can attack me. Let's make a big bombs which is bigger than everybody else. So it already comes from the fact that we just evolved from animals. So still the most driving force in our mind is desire for safety and predictability, which is unattainable in the universe. And that desire for safety and predictability forces us to these extremes, creating war machines, coming up with religions which promise you absolute safety and peace somewhere else. Those problems, basically humans have created systems which cannot resolve. They can only point to the extremes. And then they start rationalizing them, justifying them. What the art can do is not the message that the art carries. It's not a particular information piece that the art can convey, but just the artists have to mature their conscience to create art. Same way as the viewer has to reach a certain level of maturity and be comfortable, go in their own mind to the places which are not necessarily safe. By safe, what I mean is unpredictable. You never know how you're going to feel. Everybody is familiar. There are certain thoughts we really don't want to think because we don't know what we might come up with. It's much easier to follow the rigid structure. So what the art helps is to break that shell, breaks that mold, and help us to coexist with unfamiliar. See, the first impulse for us when we meet something unfamiliar is to destroy it, to turn it into familiar, to understand it, to analyze it, right? But the rest of the universe may never reveal its secrets to us. We just have to learn how to live with them, how to coexist. How to coexist with somebody who comes from a completely different cultural background. All this multiculturalism comes from, let's understand each other. That it's not going to work, always. So, nobody can understand everybody. We need to learn how to exist with this ambiguity, how not to disturb each other, even if we don't understand each other. And I think what art does, and the mature consciousness does, it helps us to go beyond this linear view of the world, good, bad, allowed, not allowed, to a more complex perception of it, which allows us to reach into our own souls and see us and make ourselves more than just machines for survival.
Yeah.
Could I just add something? I was very glad that you mentioned in your paper about all of the soldiers who, after all of their training and all of their experience, still were unable to use their weapons in battle. Now, would you say that this is an act of conscience, or you seem to imply that in some cases? I mean, they would have seen every reason for proceeding to fire their weapons.
Yeah, I think it's an act of conscience, and I think military organizers have to work sometimes consciously on how to overcome that conscience, how to train men so that they will do things that their instinct tells them is wrong.
Did you say it was 15% that didn't fire, or was it did?
15 to 20% did fire.
Did fire.
did fire. The others did not. So you have 75% of the troops who never pulled a trigger. Now, his figures have been challenged by a number of people, but still, there's a basic truth to what he says, because the Army did change its training methods.
Yeah, I remember seeing things with Navy SEALs, which have 10 to 12% passing rate. And I think you're reading out those that don't have the conscience. So you're basically, I don't know if it's instinct is the right word, but training a new set of instincts. And narrowing it down to those with that, whatever,
Real good military trainers and commanders have to know that their troops are afraid.
Are what?
Afraid?
Afraid. It is natural to be afraid in the face of danger, and there's hardly a greater danger than what a soldier faces in warfare. So you have to know that your troops are afraid. And you have to know that they have a conscience. And everything you do is to overcome those two natural instincts, fear and conscience, to get them to move out and kill the other guys.
I can't help but make a parallel to all the people that go into art school and do the training and go through it all. Come out the other end, and I think the number is something like 5% continue to even attempt to make art. And so I don't know how that necessarily relates, but that sense of conscience or something, or that ability to have that mature conscience. I mean, the act of making art, it's just a series of choices that you work through, and it's work, but not everybody is capable of actually doing that.
But you need officers over here.
You need officers.
Art officers. I'm going to move us on to the next set of propositions here. And I might jump. I want to jump to navigation. To perfection. Rubinoff has stated that art offers perfection by means of a concept of completion. It is perception of completion is arrived at by the internal judgment of the artist. Is this idea of perfection through completion that art has to offer a world preoccupied with process? So this is one of Jeffery. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, quickly. So basically, the idea is that art offers perfection through completion by the internal judgment of the artist, and that most of what we do is basically process, and that one of the things that art does is offer this sense of completion. So the questions are, how does this concept of perfection inform your own perspective of art, either of this art or other art? And what do you think the value of perfection or striving towards perfection in this particular conception of perfection is or is not? So I know the reason I'm jumping to this is because I heard you mention this, and I'm assuming that you feel that in your own work. And I know that Vaughn just perfected a couple of paintings.
I think you're going to change it now. I like imperfection, actually.
Imperfectly perfect.
Yeah. There's something nice about that little...
I mean, perfection to be clear, perfection by the perception of completion. Of completion.
Yeah.
So these are very large words. And sort of completion. What is that?
Satisfaction.
Yeah.
Is part of it.
I think we should get rid of perfection. I don't like
Yeah.
using that word in this context
What
at all.
do you like? What works for you?
I like it when it's done.
Completion.
It's done. Yeah, and bye.
Yeah, so maybe perfection's not the right word.
No, it's not, because we're getting into platonic ideals here.
That's a better word.
idea.
In the moment
When it's done.
the art enters the piece,
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
the moment of perfection and completion.
Yes.
And you will call it done when you know that.
This is the Betty. She lives with Jeffrey.
It's not the alternate standards of perfection, and it isn't that word perfection in that this is perfectly. It's the moment that the art enters the piece, and the artist knows it, and it's complete.
That's
Okay,
inspiration.
that sounds good.
Yeah, I mean,
Inspiration creates it.
Yeah, but perfection is some.
It's a different word.
Yeah.
It's a different word.
Me too. Do you want to say something? You're way on.
I said, I think it's if you view an artwork, a piece of art, and it actually tickles you or whatever it does with you, it's perfect.
And should you have that with your own work, or just like, okay, I had it where I went to a show and I was expecting to really love the Picassos and other things, but then I saw Satine, little fish kind of thing, and it made me shiver. You know, it was so, something about it that was so perfect, beautiful.
But I would like to come to what Betty said about the perfection at the moment of completion. Again, I go to this idea that we are just animals striving for safety. What is the ultimate safety? When nothing changes, nothing moves,
When you're
nothing.
dead.
This is the ultimate peace, right? Serenity. So what gives us a sensation of peace? When nothing to be done, nothing to be removed, nothing to be added, it's perfect.
Yeah.
This is a rare moment.
Yeah.
And yes, now with all the culture and everything else, we perceive it as an art entering the work. But the origin of it still goes there. It gives me a chance to experience this moment of absolute peace when nothing changes, time stops. And when time stops, it doesn't matter if it stopped for a millisecond or an hour, it still stopped. So that moment of perceived completion and perfection, I don't think about anything else can give it to a person. There is something which is somewhat similar you may experience in science, which I did. It's similar, but it's never the same. For example, when you try to solve a problem, and you work very hard on it, and you work and nothing's happening. And then you actually manage to relax your mind, and at the same time, increase your focus. It sounds contradictory, but it's actually you do it. And then the solution comes to you. But what is important that a split second before the solution pops in your head, you know you got it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what you got. You don't know the answer, but you have unshakable certainty that you will have it. And this is unshakable certainty of the future. Normally we experience only when we view the past. Let's say I broke the glass, it's lying on the floor, I can't dispute it, this is it, this is certainty, it happened. I cannot change it. And here I have the same thing pointing to the past. And something similar, I experience when I know that the work is done, whether there are some technical things left to it or anything else, time stops. And as Mika said, it's exactly what I feel when I look at great art. It's perfect in a sense, everything stops. My thoughts don't go this way or the other one. You're aware, but nothing moves.
But see, there's also, I don't think it's only an art that can be perfect.
Mhm.
There can be any time doing whatever. But just time stops and everything is perfect. If you want it all perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It just is.
A perfect moment. Right.
There's a distinction that there's a distinction between that I want to point out between completion and what Jeffrey calls process, which is, I'd like to either think about that a little bit more if we can. If that's a distinction that people can make or is useful to make, because process is everywhere. We are always in process of improving something or working towards something. But there really isn't an end to that in that kind of concept of it. There isn't really an end state or a place where it stops, right, where you can perceive it to really be completed. And a lot of the art that I have seen that use the audience to complete it, or the audience to be a part of it or interact with it, seems like that it uses the concept of process as part of its method. So like you walk in the room and then like there's a sensor and then something happens and like you Gormley's sculpture was like that when I went into White Cube. When you walk in and this thing happens and it's sort of like a bit of theater that you're kind of like a part of. And I wonder if that's a useful distinction, if that's something that feels like it makes sense to you, or is it just not something that works?
I guess I was definitely struggling with the word perfection, and so this is helpful. I really like your approach, Charo. I think that part of what I'm getting out of the threads from all these forums are that Jeffrey is working within a milieu, an environment that he's trying to express to us the forces that are driving him. But when we get down to talking about this, it's from the artist's perspective and an artist acting from consciousness, but then how do we perceive it? And I even find, like, I'll listen to music. I'm not good at art and don't always appreciate art just because I don't have those genes, but I can see something differently depending how I feel or who's with me, so I guess I'm just struggling with the word perfection, because what might seem, I understand it from the artist's perspective and the process they're going through, but whether that piece would be perfect to me one day versus something that happened to me that was really traumatic later, or it wouldn't be.
I might disagree with you, because I think the perfection is art, right? It's not subjective. Being an artist and seeing art and working with it, I have an overdeveloped sense of finding flaws in paintings. I walk in the gallery, and sometimes to me, I have to shut my eyes because they scream at me. The paintings scream at me as if they're untuned instruments. And yet, when you see a painting which is perfect, it doesn't matter how many hours I can stand in front of it. Nothing screams. It doesn't lose it. As I say, time stops. Other paintings, you look at them and your interest dwindles. It tells you all it has to say, and then it's kind of gone. But the real masterpieces, you can spend I can spend the rest of my life sitting in front of one of the Velázquez paintings, and that don't go anywhere. So, and our format may not allow us to elaborate on it, but I can go into technical details. What the actual tricks the artist plays without perception to make the piece perfect. What things they avoid, what they don't avoid, what mistakes could you make. Analogy in music, yes, everything has to be tuned in a way. So let's say perfect, it's not whether I like it or not. Not in that sense. Perfect is an absolute. It's actually, you can measure.
But what I'm saying is it can be temporal, and it can change with who's doing it. Because certainly for a symphony, one can play it and you might think it's perfect, and another symphony could play the same piece and you wouldn't think it's perfect. You understand the art, I might look at it and I see something different, the subject matter. I might not understand everything that went into it because I've never had to produce a painting. So it would be hard for me. One day I might find that perfect, another day I might see something different and not find it perfect.
We are talking about different meanings, because we're talking about like and disliking. And if you like something, you may use the word perfect to describe the fact that you like it. what I think we're talking about the perfection in this sense, the completion of art, it's something which is not subjective. It doesn't change from day to day. It's either there or not, and once it's there, it doesn't live.
For the artist, but I don't know. I mean,
Not
other people.
because at this time I'm talking not as an artist, as a viewer of art.
I'm just curious if you guys as curators want to speak to that, and if you've witnessed this thing called art perception, or if you feel like all of the public engages with art in different ways, or I don't know, what's your experience been?
Well, you have a tough crowd, don't you?
Yeah,
So I mean, this is really like
yeah.
it's a good test. Like,
Yeah, small town,
small.
diverse audience, not necessarily educated or used to art viewing.
Small budget, maybe. Or
Yeah,
big budget.
that's always an issue.
Well,
I guess I would say the kind of thing that I'm thinking about here is that we're talking about art very broadly. So I think we mostly talked about paintings.
What do you guys? What happens in the gallery? Like, how do people react to it? Are they perplexed by? Like, do you bring photography, or do you bring like literature, or what do you bring? Like, I've seen some of the catalogs.
In order to translate it.
Or no, I mean, how do you feel like they perceive it? Do they perceive it just like genetically? Like 10% of people just go, amazing.
I'd say most people just walk through and don't look.
Generally it's about painting or traditional types of art. I think it's a harder thing in our space. On the other hand, people do come in. I mean, the goosebump test that we talked about before, you get that for different reasons, like whether you're know art history or anything like that, or it's experiential, like you just kind of mentioned. There's, I think, people, even the kind of local curmudgeon that writes in the newspaper comes in. I believe he actually gets into there and has an experience like that.
But he has an idea that art should be something very specific.
You have a local curmudgeon that comes to visit.
Oh yeah, and it was a newspaper.
It's the armchair man. So he'll say, well, it's neat, but is it art? So that's like the heading of his review. But in fact, then he'll do interviews with people who come to see it, and they'll say, "Whoa, I've never thought about this before," and that is worth it for me. And we have, comment books and people who bother to write comments. Mostly it's people who are kind of like shaken or stirred in some way. So I guess that's when it feels like we're doing what we should be doing. Because everybody's going to get it in a different way, right? Because generally we're not dealing with traditional mediums either. There's all kinds of different art forms, and it stretches people's concept of art.
Yeah.
I find it's a difficult thing for us to discuss too, because art really is a language that you can learn to speak or read and interpret, and it's very much like writing. That's sort of what Sergei was saying too. As a writer, you see things in text that maybe a reader wouldn't see. And the more versed you are in that language of description, the more you can relate and understand art. Right? And you see that with people coming in to learn art history. And art is it's confrontational, and it makes people feel stupid a lot of the time. Like they have a very hard time understanding it, and they feel, well, I don't get it. What should I get about it? And I think it's a language you learn. And here, we're in a room with people who are all very creative and have been surrounded by art in one way or another. It's affected their lives, or they've been educated around it, or it's just come upon them and they get it somehow. And I think, I don't know that art perception is necessarily genetic thing. I mean, maybe some people are more predisposed to it, but I believe it is a language you can learn. Like if I really wanted to learn Mandarin, it'd be a hell of a, it'd be very difficult for me to do that. But I think if you try hard enough and if you can somehow relate it into these experiences that you have, and I think it gives you a way not just to see it, but to internalize it and think about it and then be able to express your feelings about it, or, I don't know, relate it to your own life. Art's a language, and we have the tools to discuss it and interpret it, maybe more so than most people do. So, you're presenting art in your gallery to a large populace who have no understanding of that language, or they have a very narrow, they know hi, how are you, and they know what a Picasso looks like. They have a very simplistic, word base, I guess, to describe something. And it starts off in art history like that too. You go through these very basic ways of learning about art, like line and color and form and perspective, and then they throw that all in the garbage because it doesn't all follow that simple path. So even beginning to learn a language, it's complicated because you find there's variations to the rules.
But I think there's other levels of getting it.
Yeah.
Because I don't, English is my third language, and reading those papers was not easy for me, and probably maybe a third to half the words I would have to get a dictionary for and look them up if I really want to get really into it. But what I do, I read the papers a few times and try to get it on a different level, not to understand per se every single word.
Yeah.
And then I might pick out some words and look them up and go something deeper or talk to Sergei about certain things, or so that's my level. And I think in art, if you go out and look at artwork, I think you can get that on different levels too. You don't always have to have the whole background to understand or to feel or to see, or however you want to put it, that it's a perfect piece.
Yeah.
However, I think the idea that's been put forward is that if art is imbued with perfection, then anyone should be able to perceive that, or maybe you have just an ability to appreciate it, or maybe it really moves you because it has it in it. Whatever that is, it has the magic.
Yeah.
But then that's not what you're saying, is that you may or may not be able to.
I'm just saying that
subjective.
No, I'm not. I guess I'm saying that you can be in front of a beautiful painting that seems perfect to you one day and really moves you. You may go back and something else is going on. There's a huge group of people around, or there's something's happened to you internally that's distracting you from looking at it. I mean, I guess I'm just saying it can change from time to time.
I think it's really interesting because a lot of this is and this is part of the reason I said at the beginning, the definition of art that actually was reframed as a description of art that Jeffery gave to a friend when he was giving a tour. And he warned me that was an artist's, his own description for himself. That I said, okay, well, it's useful to me, so I'll take it as a perceiver. And part of the reason I wanted to pose these questions is because of this dichotomy. Jeffery speaks from the perspective of an artist. So when you're listening from the perspective of a perceiver or a viewer, you have to remember that that's what's happening, right? It's not often, sometimes it's not going to totally translate. There might be the moment of perfection that comes in, or it's complete for the artist in their eyes. You may not be able to, you may not be able to perceive it because you haven't been able to follow the path of that artist, or understand the knowledge, or it just simply might not be complete to you, or whatever it is. I don't know. I just don't know if that concept is useful from the other side. But it looks like Sergei agrees that there's a sense of completion when you're making art that feels like it's done, and there's a sense of incompletion too when it's not done. Vaughn mentioned that he finished finished or completed things years later and rolled it out and said it needs this. I remember powerfully going back to one of your paintings, and I don't know that I perceived it as incomplete before, but I definitely perceived it much more strongly. I said, "Is this a new painting?" And he said, "No, this is a painting that's years old or a year or two old, and I just completed it. I just did something." So
Maybe that's your own maturity in art.
I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that Jeff uses process, and thinking about process and how it actually informs the art and the viewer. This is all I need for my process. And Jeff has a process that is dangerous and heavy and prolonged and a whole bunch of other adjectives that one could ascribe to it. If he wants to continue with this expression that he's doing, it is an enormous undertaking. And it is also almost literally written in stone. You know, you can't just go delete. Not when you weld it, you know. And I think that's something too which would, I mean, if I had to deal with my materials in the way that Jeff deals with it, I would be doing a very different kind of work, I'm quite sure. Mine is mostly subconscious. That's where the work is done, and then it's, you know, it's just a pen and paper is all I need, and it's, I mean, that's a great gift of poetry, is it's really portable and it's often short. You know, I go delete.
Do you think the materiality of, I think this is to ask, is your painter, the painter is a poet? Who else, how many other artists? Do you consider yourself a photographer, photographic artist, or a painter? Two-dimensional visual artist?
Neither.
Neither.
Well, I can give you a simple explanation that you may find it interesting. Imagine I'm considering myself a flat artist. And by flat artist, what I mean is I don't create the objects in this reality. I create a window or a door in a different reality. So by flat artist, I mean, you know, I start with a surface. Okay? Now, if you look at the history of the flat art, is an artist would start with a canvas or a wall or a cave, right? And then they would start breaking the surface, creating a world in it. I'm not talking about abstract art, which came much, much later, but original representational art. They would actually break through the surface, work on it, and create something you can almost look into. But because it was process done by hand, there were at different stages. You look at the painting and you see it's a painting, it's just a canvas. There's dabs of paint on it. And yet at the same time, it looks like a world in a different universe. That creates ambiguity. Our brain cannot quite process it. And ambiguity, again, genetically leads us to think it's not threatening, but it's curious, it's interesting, it creates emotional response. And in this gap of playing with the perception, that's where most of the visual flat art exists. Then comes photography. Photography, because of the very nature of photographic camera, has so many details in it. Even a bad photograph captures so much, so it already starts behind the canvas. Photography has no surface. So I spent decades trying to give photography a surface, to pull it back from inside and bring it to the surface. The moment I achieved it, I stopped being a photographer and became something else. Okay, so I do it by hand, but I can't really put a label on it. So what I do now, everything I play with the surface of flat art. Push it a little bit forward, push it a little bit back, try to multiply it, but it's all very much traditional. That's why what Jeffery says, that the artist cannot exist without the history. I couldn't have done any of this work without knowing the history of flat art.
I do have...
Hold on. Paul's been waiting. Go ahead.
I guess my question was, when I look at Jeff's list of questions, is then I look back at these Neolithic drawings. How do they fit into his idea of, how do they relate to Jeff's idea of what art is? I mean, some of them look like, I don't know, Uncle Sam Needs You type of works on the walls.
Yeah,
you know, and does that meet his? How does that fit in? I guess.
Is that art? I mean, it's old. It's definitely old, but is it art?
Definitely different than the cave paintings. I mean, you go to the cave paintings.
How I can take it listen.
The Paleolithic one, you look at it, or it speaks to you at that level, this is art.
Yeah.
This is more of somebody's trying to do something different.
Yeah.
I'll just say something to that. I can't speak for Jeff, but I think that what he would say to that is that that's his prescription for himself. He is not saying that as an artist you must do this, and that's what all of these things that he says are himself. He is not telling any other artist what to do, how to think, how to be, at all.
Yeah.
Really refrains from that. He's talking about himself in that way.
Well, that's I know.
You're trying to understand that.
He's
What you saying was, are these sort of more like macho advertising placards than the kind of art that you see? I mean, you do see animals getting killed in various ways. You see the difference in the stylized art of the Neolithic. Again, this is the evidence that has survived. We don't necessarily know what else there might have been.
But look at this one. I mean, they're like cartoons of humans. And the horse is a horse. That is a horse.
Right.
So it's very interesting that it's the same picture. Yeah.
like symbolic people, but actual
beasts. Yeah, the beasts.
I didn't pick that up.
So maybe you've nailed it. What do you perceive the value to be of striving towards perfection in art? It's hard. I think the perceivers also have to have a certain degree of maturity about a process that someone goes through. I mean, Jeff's work, appreciating how much he goes through, not understanding it all and not having seen it detailed. But it still took me a long time to decide which I appreciated. And I mean, pieces sort of grew on me. A few of them, when I first saw them, no, that's not for me. But that doesn't mean that they weren't perfect for Jeff when they were put in the field and where they were sited.
I think that it's interesting that you came to that, because something that for me that was like Picasso was like that. When I was a boy, I must have been kindergarten, and my mom had a boyfriend who was really into Picasso and made all these Picasso books. I just couldn't stand it. And they would watch things like Brazil. And I just couldn't stand it. I was like, when you're 5 years old, you're just like, what is this? It's awful. Right? But that's not a mature consciousness. Obviously, when you're 5, you know.
Maybe it was the boyfriend.
What?
Maybe it was more the boyfriend.
It was the boyfriend. Well, it's possible. There's no more now, so. But sorry, Robert, you were.
Jeff said it earlier. I was on a walk with him yesterday, and I said, I made this comment to Jeff. Jeff, I thought everything feels more complete now. I said, what have you changed? And he said, I haven't changed anything, but you have. He said, the art doesn't change, but maybe you mature a little bit.
But Karun, I think there's one very interesting thing, and I think it's more apparent here in this gallery or park than maybe in some other places. And that is, and this is on these same themes, having walked around here for I don't know how many years, is that every day that you come out here, forget how even you feel, but the day is different. And the piece, because the pieces relate to the environment, as I think Jeff describes it and talks about it. And every day the lighting changes, right? Or every hour or whatever. And when you're here in a bright, sunny, beautiful day, the art, the pieces, and the whole park, the environment, looks and feels one way. And then when you're here in the fall, and the sun is different, or when you're here in the rain, or the fog, or whatever, it seems to me the pieces are different. They are different. And if it relates to everything around it, then everything changes. Then the art changes. So I have a problem with the perfection. I can see from the artist's point of view it's completed. I like that term. But how could it be perfect? Because it's always different. And then perfect you say, I think you said it's not subjective, but, somebody made the rule up, and that, it's not like math. It's not, 2 and 2 equals 4. So isn't it subjective? Oh, maybe not. But anyway, those are the things I was thinking about as this discussion moved along, is that how does all that work when the work of art, or as one perceives it, changes almost every time you perceive it. And in some pieces, I've been out here and maybe I changed, over time, but couldn't get it or didn't understand, didn't look like anything. And I come out in a dark day or a bright day and, look at that, isn't that, that's marvelous, holy smokes. So I don't know. Those are just things I was thinking about.
Sergey wanted to, and then John, so you were up, and then go ahead.
There is no contradiction here. It's a human perception. What you describe is how you travel somewhere. Every day, different conditions, you take a different journey, different path, but it still comes to the same point. There are a million ways how you can climb the mountain Everest, but we always come to the summit. So, for example, how we perceive another person. See, this is Karun. As long as I know Karun, I never looked at him from the same angle. He never looked the same exactly, but somehow I know it's Karun. So the same is a work of art and perfection. You know it's there, but it doesn't mean you arrive to it every day at the same time. See, it's...
You don't arrive on the same pathway.
Exactly. The fact that you take different journeys doesn't mean you go to different destinations. And the mature conscience is the ability to perceive something like an object of art for what it really is, but not for what it seems. Free from particulars of a lighting, day, your own mood, or the other thing. Experience its essence.
No, but when Jeff describes it, no, he's not here, but maybe I heard it wrong, but all that makes the piece and changes the piece and is part of the piece. So it's not the same.
You're saying, how can it be complete if it's relating to the environment?
It's living. Yeah. It lives here in this terrain and environment, and as that terrain and environment changes, the piece changes.
I think that
so then it has to be universally
physical
perfect.
Piece so much as the art that
emanates from
that is part of it. And just talking, I want to point out that, I live here, and every day is different looking at those pieces. And the weather, the light, everything about it changes the counterpoint, you know, the water is doing something that's different with the sculpture. With my mind, you know.
Betty,
And you just view it differently. It never stops.
Sorry, you're saying something really interesting. I want to respond. Unfortunately, I just blocked John. And
So I just want to say, in working with Jeff, that when we're doing a site, we often chuckle that we're perfecting nature. And it's so much for the whole site is, and that's what makes everything so change from day to day. But wrestle with that one.
If you don't mind, I'm going to move on to the last set of questions because we're nearing the end of our period here. So I'll read this because I think it's I've changed the order. Rubinoff says of art that it is the map of the human soul. Each original piece is proof of the journey. As the artist navigates the unknown, his art adds to the collective memory. For Rubinoff, the human soul is no less than the totality of all human knowledge. This includes the knowledge that has been accumulated by our own effort, but also the genetic knowledge that is accumulated in our bodies by evolution. In David's 2012 presentation, which was last year's, which is available, you can either read it in here or over there, he hypothesized that the connection between several of these genetic traits evolved during millions of years of pre-agricultural human history. So while each of us has only ever has partial access to the sum of what humanity has learned, we do share the inherited embodied knowledge of billions of years of evolution if you count life on Earth, and millions of years if you count humanity, and a few 100,000 years if you count our specific piece of humanity. So what Rubinoff describes as the artist doing is navigating this total knowledge. So both the genetic knowledge and bringing back what they discovered. Is there some part of this navigation that is special or specific to art or artists? And is this perspective fruitful for you to understand the work of artists? So those are and if not, just what is your perspective? So the question is, the navigation, the human soul, the concept of the human soul that Jeffery has is a pretty matter-of-fact concept. I mean, it's not a mysterious concept in and of itself, other than the subject is quite vast. So the definition is pretty straightforward. It's just knowledge. The knowledge that we have through our own efforts that we've accumulated, but also the knowledge that we've had inherited and that's developed through nature. And he describes this process of navigating that. Sergei, you said that part of conscience is a navigational aid. I'm wondering how does this concept, both of either of these concepts, of the idea of the human soul being a total set of knowledge, so there's no necessary distinction between cultural knowledge and natural knowledge, and this idea of navigation. Is there some specific part of that knowledge that the artist is navigating, or that you see may be navigated in some other way? So again, this is just open to thoughts and comments.
One thing I really like about, again, this is my perception, about Jeffrey's work is the counterpoint aspect, and the fact that so many of these works were done to music, and the way he introduced that concept, and I think that is very soulful.
He uses these words, which are loaded words, right? I mean, the human soul is not a word that usually it makes you feel a little bit like, what do you mean by that? Unless you're like used to saying it. How do you relate to that definition? I mean, when you say the word, it seems esoteric, but then that definition is just so plain in terms of its simplicity. How does that feel or resonate? Does that seem like it's real for you, or is it awkward to think about it that way?
hand in hand with this idea of mature conscience then? Could we say them in the same breath as kind of the same idea?
Well, I don't know. I wondered if Sergei was thinking that he was, what were you navigating? I mean, if you're...
Oh, it sounds like I can describe it very specifically. But perhaps, let's look at slightly different aspects. Let me, maybe better if I approach it as a viewer before saying as an artist. For example, let's take a painting. Somebody like Velasquez. As a viewer, I look at this painting. I see a portrait of a king.
You see what?
A portrait of a king. Does it matter to me it's a portrait of a king? No. Does it matter to me that it's actually a human being portrayed there? In that particular painting? No. What gives me the goosebumps in my story, actually? And I spent a great deal of time standing in front of it, analyzing it. What gives me the goosebumps is that Velasquez plays with a very low level of my perceptions, almost at the level of my animal brain. Because I stand in front of it and I see something realistic. There's a room, there's a curtain, I can see the armor on a person, so it's real. And at the same time, I see the canvas, I see the brush strokes, and no matter how hard I try, I cannot focus just on the brush strokes or just on reality. They're so blended together, so it totally stores my mind from way deep inside. With some other artists of a lesser caliber, I have to walk back and forth, approach the painting or step back until I find this point of equilibrium where the real balances the art. And then it gives you this ambiguity and you can feel it. You go a little closer, it becomes just paint. You step a little further, it becomes too real. But what Velasquez does, he's a master in this case. That's why no matter what you do, you cannot avoid perceiving both of them. So in this case, what he does, it's a navigation at a very low level of our human perception. That I totally can relate with my work because I play with the same in a different techniques, but I play with the same levels of perception. How human eyes can see it. Look, for example, at another aspect of it. Humans experimented with so many different forms of flat art, from totally black squares to representational figures. However, there are very few paintings which were circular or triangular. And even those were done for a particular purpose to fit something in. Even abstract work is done on a rectangular canvas. Why? Because it's much easier for our brain, as it evolved, to perceive a work of art as separate from its reality. It's different from a sculpture because, any flat art doesn't want to be part of the wall. It wants to be a universe in itself. So, as an artist, you have to know all of these aspects. You have to know how to navigate. Then comes the next level, culture. An artist may choose that he doesn't care what it particularly represents. And yet some others may paint a historical scene or a reference to literary figures like a portrait of Hamlet and Ophelia. So when you watch it, the title that it's a Hamlet and Ophelia is important to understand it, and actually it adds to a perception of how they interact with one another. Then inevitably an artist has to navigate the top level of his own personality where he does, which is unique, what you create. So I think it's very specific, this is a navigation, you have to know your way around it. And you can't just wander about, try this, try that.
So that's pretty demanding. Your standard of art. Well, I'm not suggesting you do. I'm just saying it's. You're suggesting that you have to come to that place before the art is going to be a part of what you're doing. otherwise are just wandering around.
That I think, probably I got from the science. When I was a student, part of the job of my professor was to review a little papers which were sent to the Academy of Science by amateurs. And one day, he received 1,000 pages of something which was scribbled on a brown paper. There was a proverbial cobbler somewhere in Siberia in 1960s who invented calculus. He was totally oblivious to what Newton or Leibniz or everybody else. He invented calculus from scratch. He spent several decades and sent it up. So what do you do? What do you tell him? Tell him you're a genius, but it's been done several hundred years ago? Or you tell him keep continuing, or you tell him it's all rubbish? That's why I believe in this day and age, if you want to be an artist, this is my personal belief, you cannot just go local. You have to see yourself in the context of the entire art which went before you. So I developed this model for myself, my own standard is, imagine that there is a big museum, one huge wall, where all the art which has been created is hanging. And the rules, simple, everything is mixed together at random. So you never know who's going to be hanging next to you. And if you feel comfortable entering your art, so you think it's okay if you happen to be in the same room with some others, that's good. If you think that you need to have your own room because you don't want people to compare yourself to somebody else, you're not quite there yet.
Maybe you don't want them with you.
That's a different story.
That is the challenge, though. So many young artists that I talk to are afraid of this question of originality, and it paralyzes them because they feel like it's all been done before.
Because they're not mature. They haven't reached the level of clarity, which there is this impulse that they know what they're doing. And maybe they never will.
I think it becomes more and more difficult.
I mean, as you reach a point where nothing new can be possibly said.
Well, I think it's easier for painters or photographers, probably. But if you're trying to push the boundaries of what art could be, and that's when it gets a bit complicated because, I mean...
There's a limit to how much art could be. Like, you mean like new media? Or
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Whereas you can be original in the framework of a canvas, because you're making that in this framework. I think that it's more difficult if you're looking at the contemporary art world, for instance, and trying to do something that somebody else hasn't done yet.
That's probably not a successful.
What do you mean by doing something?
Like, I don't think you consciously go out there thinking, I'm going to break a boundary or go somewhere I've never gone before, but part of that was your conscience and maybe the decision making or the path that you take to get there. Amongst that is, I mean, we seem to be overwhelmingly talking about painting. Somewhere along the line, maybe more so with sculpture or something, you make a decision for material or medium. So that's part of that path, and I don't think it's a conscious, like, I can't do this because I'm not doing anything brand new or trying to break a mold. It's this idea of art and what makes it up or what you use to make it is all part of that.
What is it? Are you saying that young artists are driven by the idea of being original?
I don't think so. I think that's what paralyzes them when you start thinking too much about that idea of that. I mean, you don't. I don't think that's. I mean, the process isn't okay. Something original.
Right.
It's you make these decisions along the way, take this path, and then maybe you are this genius, whatever or however, but and you suddenly broken a new whatever, new path or something, or brought a perspective in.
Paul, you seem to have some visuals over here. Were you agreeing or disagreeing? You're
You're wiggling.
You were like, I'm so comfortable with that. Was that me just?
Well, I'm not an artist, so I don't really understand this process that you go through, but it seems to me that it comes from something irrepressible. Like, it's got to be almost obsessive or compulsive, or there's a need to freeze time. I forget who mentioned that, about stopping time, whether it's a vision or an idea, or whatever it is you want to. And then I can get perfection, because that's the only time you actually ever have it, is when you conceive it. And, then you do the best you can to make it in whatever medium you're dealing with, whether it's plays or music or sculpture or whatever it is. You try and capture that thing, but it's not something that I don't think, for me anyway, that somebody goes out, I really got to go out and create something here. It's more, I can't help it.
The way that I found that I perceive, and I don't know if this is really true, but the way I envision it is that you try to come to a place of knowledge, and then once you come to a place of knowledge, and you're an artist, that's the way that's what you do anyway. So your art is coming out anyway. I mean, I think that's, so it's almost the other way around. You couldn't set out to do something original. It'd just be bizarre. You would, first of all, have something real and have some kind of insight or come to a certain place within yourself that you can actually say, okay, I've come to this perception, and now, because I'm an artist, I'm going to write about it, or I'm going to paint about it. And I get the sense that for some artists it's a really different process, and that it's not really a conscious one, but I feel like there is value in the idea of maturity as at least a word that, you become mature, whether it's through your own efforts or time or circumstance, and that if you're an artist, that filters through into your work. But I really get a lot out of works that are at a level of maturity that were beyond mine at that point, because I kind of get pulled towards that. I didn't really see the world that way, or I didn't really have that knowledge before I read that novel, or I saw that painting, or I listened to that music. I didn't think that was a possible part of experience. So I really do feel like once you start thinking about art as a source of knowledge, it just becomes to me, it just became so obvious. Even if you reduce it from the standards of absolutely the most amazing knowledge in the world, that you just almost every part of my consciousness is structured by some kind of narrative and some kind of artistic input. The really important parts, anyway. So,
Well, I was just thinking that really, oftentimes I think that art is evidence of a process. It's the tools that you're using to get to that place of knowledge, rather than it being the end in itself. It's what happens along the way, and whatever form. Like Paul is obsessed by theoretical physics, and it's very close to poetry when you get to that level. It's sort of like, I don't know, we're all really talking about the same kind of thing, and that's an experience, a place of being, which a kind of rapture, really, I think. And
what's that mean?
Rapture?
Yeah.
Out of body, just in, lifting off.
Okay.
Full of light. Union.
I think, Sergey, maybe you mentioned this earlier, that art is in the realm of, or it embodies abstract thinking. So I think that that's the specialness of art, that it's not language in any other form, that we understand. It's not like spoken language. It's not. It can be. I don't know how to describe it.
Prescriptive. It's not prescriptive.
Yeah, yeah. It's a way of communicating the world in a way that is like no other way that we do it in our functioning lives. But maybe that's like that what you're describing about entering into that realm in there.
Well, the perception, how people view the art, it keeps changing all the time. And I think what's so good about the modern times is we have so many media, right? Which, yes, it pollutes our universe with so many images, pictures, and other things, right? But because it's so easy these days to create an image. Well, 100 years ago, you have to be a pretty skillful draftsman to create that image. So it helps us to rethink the world, what art really is. So it's not really about narrative. If you want to describe something, take a picture or tell a story. You know, that's, I think, you know, how we look at the history of our art, but also the very descriptive, narrative pictures really lose their importance. While some others, which give us, you know, just chills and goosebumps, become more prominent. So that process, I hope, will continue in the future, because this, in my view, how it changes our perspective, it changes how we look at ourselves. And I think it's very courageous for Jeffery to bring this issue. How do we get out of this predicament where we rationalize the war and the need to defend ourselves, another thing. And I think that's why this discussion is very important, because the opposite of it, saying let's just love each other and let's understand each other, it's not going to work either. I think what this art teaches us how to deal with unknown, something that we can sense but not identify. This is the hardest challenge, you know, how do you live somewhere which doesn't give you immediate comfort? Because the first reaction, do you go for the gun to shoot it, or you're trying to talk to it, or you make friends with it? What if it's nothing in between? What you just pass by, absorb? This is what happens more and more when there are more human beings happen on Earth. You live in a big city, so many cultures, clashes, it makes your head spin. How do we deal with it? And I think non-representational art, the art without narrative, and yet which speaks to us on an emotional level, learning how to understand that art, how to let it in your mind, helps us to deal with the complexities of the modern and future world.
Well, I don't know how I can really follow up that, except for to say that we're at the end of our period.